Hi, it's Paul Banis, GreatDad.com, and thank you very much for joining either the podcast or the YouTube version of the podcast. I'd really appreciate it if you took just a second to subscribe either on your podcast app or in YouTube. It doesn't really do anything. It's not going to send you any emails. It's just going to show up more often on your feed, and it does me a lot of good in terms of getting more exposure for this work I do to support dads. I'd also like to invite you to come to my page, GreatDad.com/go, if you'd like to discuss more about any of the issues that we are covering within the podcast, especially if there's any way I can help you to be a sounding board in your own struggles to be a dad and to be there for your family. So take a look at that. It also includes a link to my course on gratitude, where at GreatDad.com/gratitude with a offer to take that course for free. So see you in a second. Hey, it's Paul Banis at GreatDad.com here with my weekly podcast talking about modern fatherhood. And I'm excited today to talk to a colleague of a real hero of mine, Michael Gurian of the Gurian Institute, who's been working with him and writing a new book. And so I've got the author today of Boys, a Rescue Plan, and who's also the president of the Global Initiative for Boys and Men. So welcome, Sean Kullman.
Thank you much. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Just, when I heard what your title is right away, I thought this sounds like a title of a very conservative organization that is trying to make sure that the patriarchy is somehow, conserved, and we want to make sure that men are put back in their rightful place on the throne, which, of course, is not at all where I'm coming from. I think, like Michael, and I would imagine, like you, we believe that everybody should have the right to become whoever they want to be in any way they can, but that we also kind of have, despite being very progressives, we are also very rooted in reality and data. And it sounds like you have a big background in research and analysis and know kind of the facts behind what some of the things are going on in society today. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we definitely want our boys and our girls to thrive. We want our men and our women to thrive. I mean, that's good for human flourishing, right? And so, yeah, my background really is in researching the data, going to policymakers and trying to educate policymakers who may not even know that 80% of the suicide deaths in their state are male. And you
Right.
tell them that, and they're like, "What was that number?" And so, just things like that, a little bit of a disconnect. And that's where my data stuff came in. And Michael and I got together and started working on this book.
Right. Because he studied parenting and ways to help your kids along the way, and at the same time, I guess, looking at differences between the two sexes and how some people, I mean, there are boys who do things like girls and girls who do things like boys, and that's wonderful. But in general, when you look at the data, there are these sexual differences. And right now we are at a point in history, at least in the United States, where boys are not doing as well. And I guess some people would say, well, they've got it coming because they've owned the world for, 60,000 years. But I think you and I probably do worry about boys. I've got a 20-year-old boy, and he seems to be doing fine, but my heart would be broken if he were being passed up because of.
Well, and I think it's right. And I have a background in teaching. I taught English for a long time, different
Mhm.
levels, high school and college, and even dabbled in middle school. And seeing that whole difference of growth. And so I was employing kind of Gurian models even before I knew Gurian, and then refreshing with Gurian, and understanding that boys and girls do learn differently, but there are exceptions where this is in the aggregate we're talking
Right,
about.
right.
Some boys.
And that's so important to say that you can't say, well, this is the data, boys and girls are these separate things, because in the aggregate they're very different, but the individual is a different story. Yes, I'm sorry to.
Of course, not at all. And I think that's really, really important. And so the more we move away from that, and I think the nation's report card scores that just came out show that we're failing both our boys and our girls in math,
Mhm.
if we're being honest with one another. And so that's what the scores are telling us. And so when we look at what's happening with struggling boys in education, I mean, the single biggest gap, educational gap in the United States and really the Western world is the reading gap
Mhm.
by far. And
Yep.
so that's something we need to start looking at why. And schools are spending millions of dollars and millions of dollars looking at math programs and all these programs, but it's the pedagogical delivery that matters, which could cost significantly less if you're employing a boys and girls learn differently model, but also understanding that there are going to be some boys and some girls who kind of move a little bit away from that aggregate, right? So I think the way Michael describes it, and I agree, is you have to think of there's a male brain and there's a female brain and there's a male spectrum and there's a female spectrum, and understanding that component helps. And I know in the classroom, I've seen it and I've
Right.
worked with it.
Right. Yeah, because you wouldn't want to have a one size fits all program and then artificially make sure that some people uh, were like pushed even harder within that program. It makes more sense to have two different approach. I mean, potentially two different approaches. If you have a reading challenge and you realize that when you put boys and girls together, I mean, you either dumb down to the lowest common denominator, or you focus on one approach versus the other, because boys and girls do. I mean, I remember never being a kid myself and consistently having does not listen attentively in class. It's still imprinted in my brain, that report card score. But boys don't learn the same way girls do. I guess from my experience watching classes and watching my both my boys and girls, the girls seem to get a lot more preference within the modern school system because they're more well behaved, they're more attentive, whereas the boys are, running around and crazy. Is that a basic sex
And let me
difference
tell you where
between
that
boys and
where
girls?
that can act. There's some truth in that, but let me tell you where there's some danger in it too.
Hmm.
So I'll give you an example. If a girl is behaving in class, the teacher can easily confuse behavior with skill acquisition.
Sure.
So now the test scores come back and say the girl's not doing well in math. I'll just make that up. You know, and you're like, well, no, that can't be right. It is right. Because again, there was a confusion with behavior and skill acquisition. The boy who's running around the classroom, say, crushes a test, and like, how's that possible? He can't even sit still for 5 minutes. Well, that's not as much the problem today. Pretty much math scores are pretty the same, but that does happen to girls who are behaving well, right? And so again, people, oh, they must know what's going on, and maybe they don't, the child doesn't. And same with the boy, he may be not doing well and say, oh, because he doesn't sit still. Well, there could be other reasons for that, and it's not ADD and it's not ADHD, it's the delivery. And so
Hmm.
pedagogical approaches are really where we should be looking to store this. So to get back to your point is, yeah, I mean, boys are suspended more by far, and I find for sometimes incredibly innocuous things. In the book we talk about a boy who was suspended for using a person's wrong pronoun, and he didn't do it maliciously or
Mm.
intentionally. This is someone the boy knew as a child, and the girl now identified as a he. And when someone saw the child walk in, his friend says, "Well, why is so and so dressed like that?" And he just said, well, she's a boy now. And he got suspended. And
Mm.
so that just tells you this. Now realize this was a 14 or he was right at 14, almost turning 15-year-old boy. He's trying to process this.
Right.
And
Yes,
there's
we all.
almost no compassion. So that's a perfect example of just how quick we are to penalize a child
Yeah,
for
well, I don't know if we want to get into that whole aspect of where we are, where there are these cases that are so egregious that people of left and right are like, well, how could that even happen? And then there are obviously people trying to make political points of the fact, like, see, we should throw out all the pronouns and all the sensitivity to trans people and everything because of these kind of anecdotes. But I hear your point is that more that boys could be penalized for something seemingly innocuous where maybe a girl wouldn't. But why do you think there's been this change, or has there been a change over time in the way boys and girls were taught, that boys used to be, we used to think of that boys were getting the preferential treatment, and that they were the ones who were the loudest, so they got the most attention. The girls sat in the back of the class and meekly, didn't really achieve because they didn't speak up. And then has there been a shift? I mean, in your research in the last 50 years on
For
how
sure,
boys and
there's
girls
been
are?
a there's been a dramatic shift
Yeah.
in how we're educating our kids, and I think. It's interesting. I wrote there's a chapter in the book called when America embraced Wonder Woman and forgot GI Joe.
Uh-huh.
Really, we needed to do more for girls, for
Yep.
sure, women. But at the same time, the assumption is it was born out of some patriarchal thing. In the 1920s, barely anyone went to college. And if there wasn't someone at home taking care of the children, they died.
Right.
That's what happened. And so we have to look at this as an evolutionary thing, right? That as our society changed and as our needs changed, and as we needed more women in the workforce to become doctors and lawyers, all those sorts of things, right? We kind of moved in that direction. But the preferential treatment in the classroom started in great part because as we tried to ensure equality, we moved in a completely different direction. And that's what ended up happening. And now the pendulum swung so far over. You had, female only scholarships in the late 80s and 90s when they were already outpacing men,
Yeah, right.
right? So to give you an idea.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is such dangerous territory to talk about because it I can just hear potential listeners bristling about some of these statements, and we're just trying to
Let's put it
understand it.
this. If you go to any state in the country, you're going to find that women far outpace men. This
Right.
across every racial group in college enrollment,
Right.
college graduation rates.
Yeah, you can't deny the fact that there are far more women now in college
Correct.
than men. Uh,
I think it
and
was like 2.8 million more women graduated from 2016 to 2020,
right. Yeah.
right? And it's been like that for years and decades now. So so I think people I think and I think there's a little bit of a concern because when we talk about boys, there's always this sort of need to feel, well, we better not make sure we're including women. And so you get the bait and switch. When we're focusing on issues impacting boys and men,
Yeah.
there'll be an attempt to shift the conversation. And I think it's important to stay focused on it. So why are boys struggling, right? Imagine being in a school where you're hearing things at the age of 9 and 10 about toxic masculinity. I mean, at 9 and 10, you're just happy when you're cookies, right? And
Right.
so that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about that we need to stay focused on. Why is this happening consistently, not just in education, but in physical mental health and in so many areas? And so that is part of it. But there's been a cultural shift, and that has definitely moved away from recognizing sex differences, especially in the last couple of years, and forwarding women's opportunities and blaming men far too often. And I know people are going to, have something to say about that, and I'm fine with that.
Well, like, is this a conversation that we have a lot in our house about the patriarchy? And I guess whenever we talk about it, I kind of go off on a tangent that my family knows all too well about the fact that most of us who are in the patriarchy, we don't go to a club, we don't belong to an organization. I don't think I don't feel the fact that doors open for me, but women definitely feel that there is some sort of patriarchy going on. And when I look at it, to me, it's more like it's way, way up at the top. Certainly not in our current time where women have most of the opportunity. The doors that I seem to see closing are higher up the chain. It's the more into the senior management, old boys club who runs the government and the whole our whole capitalist system rather than getting a job in a starter job or a middle management job. Is that seem to
Well,
be?
it's really interesting. Mark Zuckerberg just came out and started talking about the need for a little bit more masculinity
Yeah,
in the C-suite.
right.
Like he's seen this kind of shift, and it's kind of funny to me, right? Because he's morphed into this person who's found this whole new assertiveness in his physical activity. He's more fit. He's involved in the mixed martial arts stuff. He enjoys it as an exercise. And now he's like, you know what? We kind of, and he grew up with three sisters and he has three daughters. And so his whole life has been surrounded by, women and girls, and it's great, right? And there's my part, making sure we're inclusive. And so, but at the same time, he's like, where was this my whole life? Right? He felt a part of his soul was missing. And so I think that, at least the way I see it, I don't really care who my leader is. I just want them to be good at their job.
Right. Yeah.
And I
Right.
think most people are that way. I think keeping a narrative alive that there's this patriarchy out there holding people down is part of that oppressor oppressed narrative. There's a reason we have, multiple offices on offices of women's health and none on men. None.
Hmm.
And so even though men are, as we said before, 80% of suicide deaths, 72% of overdose deaths, 71% of alcohol deaths, they're far more, boys, for instance, are far more likely to die of respiratory disease as an infant. It has to do with the fragile Y, right? The Y chromosome is more fragile. And my point, so, women outlive men by, 6 years, roughly. It was 1 year in 1920. And so when we start looking at all these structures that have been created, they were born out of keeping families together. Now we're kind of morphed into this, well, we aren't living in a traditional family all the time, where there's moms at home and dad's working, in the field and all of that. And so, is that making sense at all? Because I'm trying to get us to the point where I think that women have all kinds of opportunities.
I'm totally getting the point. I think I'm with you because that there seems to be this like legacy impression of what is going on and versus the reality of the modern time. My wife works in digital health and she's very familiar with all the absence of studies with women because they were studying heart disease and cancer in men rather than women. Very, very little research until recently on menopause, for example. But I wonder if whether we kind of missed, we've missed the last 20 years or 30 years in history with because we keep on imposing this old idea of what
1972 version.
exactly. Yeah. Doesn't is that what we're dealing with and that we need to collectively catch up with where we are today with the data, the actual data, modern data?
I would probably, Michael and I, talk about this in the book, right? But he calls it like a feminophobia. And the idea of going against the what I like call this kind of feminist industrial complex, where you have these groups that are to survive. This is what they need to do. This
Yeah.
is how they earn their living. This is how they survive. And it sounds awful, follow the money, right? And so I think that there are groups that really do work against the best interest of the whole. And I'll give you the perfect quick example. It's something Warren Farrell, I don't know if you're familiar with Warren Farrell's work. And, Warren was the first male to serve as the National Organization of Women chair in New York, 3 consecutive
Hmm.
terms. So he was working with Gloria Steinem and all that. And they were talking about what was best for the family, even during divorce. And so they both knew that what was best for the family was that mother and father were involved.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Steinem was worried that, well, if I say that, I'm going to lose my now membership.
Right.
So what was
Right.
more important, the kids or the movement?
Yeah.
And that's what you're seeing is now you have an entire industry in academia, media, and government that thrives on making sure we are classifying the oppressor oppressed model.
Yeah.
And that's really real. And you see it in grants, you see it in offices of health, you see it in state commissions on the status of women and girls. And I'm going to bring this up because it's really important. Is National Coalition for Men, of which I'm now a member and a plaintiff. We're suing the state of California for violating the Equal Protections Clause. And so
Hmm.
that just came out this week. So you're the first to get it as a podcaster, Paul, because they are violating the Equal Protections Clause by having a California Commission on the status of women and girls in a state where boys are behind in education across all races and all the other stuff I've talked about, and not having a California Commission on the status of boys and men.
Yeah, this is so challenging because I you know, I just think that a lot of people just would turn this off and not want to even understand it because it goes so much against what progressives stand for. But it's the same thing on the right. There are people who are so invested in causes, even as
Of course.
illogical as they are. That's how they make their money. That's what brings in the donations, and they're not going to change anytime soon. Maybe we should bring this back to the kids, since this is a dad I mean, dads are affected by by these changes as well as men. But for our kids, um, what are there? What things should dads be aware of as their kids are coming up that are dangerous for them, or that they should try to help with, based on the data we're seeing, these kids who are potentially in trouble. I mean, if you say that we need a rescue plan, it
Yeah.
sounds like, it's a dangerous situation.
So what I would say is, and this relates to actually what we just talked about a moment ago, is that dads need to be aware, very aware, and moms need to be embraced in this as well, that watching their sons and dads watching their sons, that what's going on in school, is my son part of or observing how he's being uh, treated differently. I would be against any, I would encourage them to, hey, if you want to help them be better at math, you're going to need to work with them. If you want to help them be better at reading, here's an actual thing you could do. If you find your kid might be struggling a little with reading, what I would do is get an actual copy of the physical book and an audio version and have them read and listen at the same time, immersion reading, which really does help with comprehension because if they're a slower reader, they suddenly are going through the book a little faster and the comprehension's going up and all of that helps them. So that's something dads can do now with their kids. And so I think that's a strategy that they can use to help their son become a better reader. Okay.
Hmm.
And when it comes to the math stuff, try to make it as physical as possible. Now, that being said, in the school system itself, they need to be aware. I'm a big believer in citizen science. And you'll
Yeah, when I
find
asked.
dads and you'll find parents. They should find out what their school district is doing, and they should get the reading and math scores, and they should bring it to the board and say, look, why is this happening? They need to become citizen science and advocate for their children. That's the best thing they can do. But every school community, every district should have a group of parents who get the data, usually from the state, and disaggregate that data and say, okay, here. And then let's peel back the layer a little further. So if you're a single parent, whether a single dad or a single mom, I'm telling you from the get-go, unless uh, there's other people in place to help that child succeed, they're already starting behind the eight ball before they even, and we know this in our school system. Kids who come from single, we already know from the get-go that statistically they're going to struggle.
Hmm.
So school systems need to change to do that. I know, but parents need to go to school board meetings with the data and get them to peel back the layer a little further. So wait a minute. So now we know kids from single, but well, what are we doing to help them become better readers? What are we spending our money on? Is there a summer reading program? So if you have a son who is right on the cusp of proficient, just barely there by a point or two at, say, reading or math, you need to say, okay, look, we need something over the summer because what's going to happen, they're not going to do anything over the summer. And they'll tell you, oh, no, no, they're fine. They're proficient. But they're really hanging on a thread to being below basic and proficient. That's how close they are. And
Hmm.
so why aren't resources continuing to help those children into the summer? And schools have resources and they say they don't. It's about, I think it's about directing resources toward pedagogical approaches at work. So
Hmm.
that's what I think dads and moms can actually do to help their kids. At least that's one strategy is immersion, but also getting your school boards to really look at like successful models like the Gurian model, where boys and girls learn differently is a very successful model, and the data is there to support it as well. From every imaginable school, from Title I schools to private schools, all and up and down the spectrum of schools. Single sex schools, co-ed schools, they've been very successful.
Yeah. Well, I think there's been a long time push for single sex education for girls for that reason, because the boys supposedly dominated. Maybe at one time they did. They ran the roost. But that women were helped out, or young girls were helped out, by not having loud boys in the classroom. But there doesn't seem to be as much of a push for that for boys at the same time. I mean, I just don't hear any calls for going back to single sex education for boys, because they seem to already have that advantage. And again, I think we're dealing with this 1970s paradigm.
Well, I have one of my sons graduated from a single sex boys school, and the other one is in college now, and the other one is currently in a co-ed school,
Uh,
right? And so I think you need to, but it's a smaller school, and I think it's a perfect fit. And so you really, I think we can't have a one size fits all. And the argument behind single sex schools is, oh, you know, women will fall behind. And actually, the opposite is true. In New Zealand, they allow you to go to co-ed or single sex. And what they found unfair was the only single sex schools were those that people could afford to pay for. And what happened is you saw more girls going into STEM when they then in the co-ed experience, you saw more boys going into the kind of liberal arts than you would have seen going into co-ed experience. And so all these kind of interesting
hmm.
things happened. And I think we have to get away from the one size fits all model. I remember, I'm pretty sure it was Texas, it was a number of years ago. I read about a teacher and he worked with struggling readers. And within a year or so, he had them proficient. They were doing well, and it was in a single sex environment. And those boys were suddenly proficient in reading. They were excited about reading. It was growing. ACLU came in and said, "You can't do this." It's not they didn't offer single sex for girls. They just had the one. Someone could have easily done it. But that's a perfect example of the enemy of the good.
Right.
It's not going to be one size fits all. Some boys and some girls may do better in single sex environments, but you can also run lessons within a classroom. I've done it that appeals, that uses a boys and girls learn differently model in a co-ed environment.
Hmm.
And so I think we just have to start being much more adventurous and just a little more realistic because our test scores are not showing that we're doing it. And it's not always the teachers, by the way. There's a lot of really good teachers out there, and they come to me, they send me emails, they give me phone calls, and they're just struggling. They know what they need to do, and they're hampered by administrative structures that are making them do other things that are completely unrelated to pedagogy.
Right. Right. Um, are there other things that I just wonder in within families how you can change that prejudice going in that kind of sometimes actively works against boys. I mean, I hear it from other parents who are complaining that their boy is in a co-ed school and is being told that he's an oppressor by, in
Yeah,
in certain situations actively told that, or even on college campuses, and the kid's like, I don't I don't know what I don't have that history, so I don't know really, I don't know why I'm suddenly guilty of this. But do you see this like in some families where it's harder to convince the mom or the dad that there really is an issue here and that somehow everybody should be alike and figure it out?
it's funny. There's a woman I'm really good friends with, and she's a mother of four sons, and she's a teacher. And
Uh-huh.
said until I had boys, I was not as good a teacher.
Uh-huh.
The light bulb went off, and she says, "Oh my gosh, they're so different." And now she's great with boys and girls, right? So that's one. But what parents too, I think they need to be a little bit assertive, especially in instances when, and I've told this to my sons, if you're, and they're good kids, they don't get in trouble and all that. But I said, if you're in a situation where you're in school and you feel as though you're being somehow criticized for something that you're, unresponsible for, feel free at that moment to say, you know what? I want my father present, or I'm done this conversation. I'm really uncomfortable. You're making me uncomfortable. If it's a teacher, and say, I want my parent present. Just end the conversation, especially if they're getting into what you were talking about, the oppressor thing. And if they want to go there, now having an open conversation in the classroom is different. But literally, remember, there were schools in this country where it happened, where they were putting people and yelling at them.
Yeah.
And so that to me is the most bizarre and abusive thing I've ever seen. And I think that it's important for us and for young men to say, you know what, I'm not an oppressor. And, I consider it really offensive and just move on. I think it's an offensive comment. Clearly not an oppressor based on my immutable characteristics. And I think they have to be assertive and just say it. Just say that's the end of the conversation. Good luck.
Yeah. It's
I know
just
that's hard, but I'm moving that direction of convincing young men, don't be, just be yourself and just say, you know what,
yeah,
that's
it's so tied up with so much history and colonialism and years of slavery and years of civil rights and everything for this to to somehow change and be enlightened that you just because you are a boy doesn't mean you are somehow guilty of.
Well, no boy has control over anything.
Right, yeah.
I mean,
I mean,
he has
unless he
zero
is an
zero
oppressor, obviously.
authority. There is no 11-year-old boy out there has any authority in the world.
Right,
So, I mean, maybe there's someone out there, but they're not really here. So when they start doing that, that's when nah, children don't really have authority.
right.
Children.
I think we as parents we want to believe that they're all, they're good, all good and innocent until proven otherwise, and until they actually commit some of these crimes, they're not really guilty.
And they're not really crimes.
They're not really. Yeah.
And I do worry. I mean, and I do really do worry about kids from the single parent homes. And single parent homes can happen in a lot of different ways. You lose a parent, out of wedlock births, all kinds of things. And we're seeing massive increase in the number of out of wedlock births. And so we really have to, that's an issue I think young men need to harness themselves around, to be honest, and women.
Are
And,
are boys more adversely affected by those
oh
situations?
yes, for sure.
And why do you think that is?
Statistically, boys from single parent homes are much more likely to go to jail. Girls too are more likely to get pregnant, or turn to drugs, but the outcomes for boys are worse from single parent homes than girls. And I think that goes back to something you mentioned earlier. What is the school system doing? Is it encouraging the girl more than it's encouraging the boy? Is the boy acting out in very normal ways because he manifests his frustration physically or aggressively, that sort of a thing. And the funniest thing of all is a teacher will sit with a boy and say, find your words. I'm sorry. He's just like, give me a break, right? He's processing in his own way. When he's stressed, what's going on in his brain, the prefrontal cortex and way back here in the midbrain where he's angry, that there's no connection there like it is with the girl who is verbalizing her anguish, who is doing that and expressing it. Um,
And
and
who will do that for the rest of her life versus
Yeah, and they're sensitive boys who do,
men.
right? But there's something different going on there. And it's funny, when I was a teacher and kids would act up in class, I just it's like, look, you're gonna come after school, you're gonna clean my desktops. You can't probably can never do that today. And they would come and clean my desktops, and I'd give them a treat, like a cookie or something. Say, we got each other, like, yeah, I got it, Mr. Coleman. And they move on. Everybody moved on. And that was kind of how I would handle it. Didn't need to call the parent, didn't need to bring in a principal. And I think when you start to understand what happened is when they start cleaning, it's a physical activity, they understand why they're there, and everyone goes away and you can form these kind of bonds because two things happen. One, you handled it with the child, Two, you rewarded them in a way, right? For, hey, I appreciate you coming after. And when they say sorry, it's like, well, for what? I know what I think it was. What do you think it was?
Hmm.
And it was a physical activity that got the brain going that allowed them to talk. You want to get a boy to talk, go sit out front and shoot some hoops, have a catch with a baseball,
Right. Yeah.
things like that. And you'll get his blood flow going. And all of a sudden that, wow, there's a prefrontal cortex. I didn't know they had one of those.
Yeah. Dads and boys know that.
Yeah.
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 So what is your experience right now? I mean, do you have like tons of support on the left and the right about these issues? Does it like vary from group to group? I mean, so much of what Michael has done is so research oriented. I mean, you can disagree with, I guess, individual studies or how the methodologies and things, but a lot of the data is pretty like we were saying, like the college acceptance rates or college admissions rate. But people on the left and the right must both hate you.
It's your answer. I think most people know we need to do more.
Yeah.
I really do. I think so. The best thing I heard from a California policymaker, coincidentally, was that when I met with a policymaker's main staffer and we went over data in California, and the person knew it. and 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 didn't know the data was that bad.
Hmm.
Said, how do you have a political future if you even mention boys and men?
Right. Right.
So this isn't about the right thing to do. And I said, well, it's easy. You say, I don't want them dying.
Yeah.
I want them having an education. I want them contributing to their community. But
Right.
that's that feminophobia piece, the fear of going against the feminist lobby, as Michael calls it in the book. That fear of going against the feminist lobby is driving a lot. When as Warren, this is Warren Farrell's phrase, it's pretty simple. When one sex wins, both sexes lose. And
Yeah.
that's the truth.
Yeah.
And so I have a very, competent wife. I have 7 nieces. I want them all to do well. We have a big family. So
Yeah.
it's, with 21 nieces and nephews, they're all over. And so my point is that we really have to get over the hump. We got to look at the numbers and say, look, this is what's happening. We need to fix it. Boys aren't, performing poorly in school because of toxic masculinity, bravado. That's not the reason. When they're learning, they're good. When they're not learning, they're distracted.
Hmm.
And that's the way we need to start looking at it. And honestly, I mean, the lawsuit here in California should be very interesting to see how it works its way through the system. But it's important because unfortunately, those are the steps people have to go through in order to try to really bring equality to the boys.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate having this conversation with you. I just, it makes me uncomfortable because of all the reaction that comes about when you have these conversations. But you can be, I mean, I have a very, I have a very strong wife, and I have a wonderful, very intelligent, forceful daughter as well. And I believe completely in strong women, but I also worry about boys and to some extent men in this culture that for a while seems to be going, one sex versus the other sex, and like so many things that are going on among all these different people. How can we find ways to lift everybody up rather than forcing one person, one group down while the other one climbs? And that seems to be like just a basic problem in our culture today, is that it's a zero sum game for every group, and we struggle to kind of make all the boats rise.
Well, and I do think we're not honest if we want to really,
Yeah.
get to the point. We're not honest about the data. We don't share the data.
Mm.
We don't. There was a piece in the New York Times about this boy who took his own life. Lawrenceville prep is a private boarding school in New Jersey. I think it's the most expensive boarding school in the country. And I want fathers to hear this because I think it's important for us to read and see
Hmm.
how we ignore important information. The story's about this boy who took his own life, 17 years old. And the only statistic in the entire article was that girls were more depressed during COVID, which is fine if you want to talk about, hey, we're talking about teen suicide, mental health, fine. What they didn't tell you is, I think it was 78% or 80% of the deaths in that age group are male. Like that appears nowhere in an article. And that's where media bias works itself because again, there was a golden opportunity there to say this definitely impacts boys more. We just want to mention there's some teen mental health issues for
Wow.
girls,
Wow.
and they don't do it. And
Right.
that's why whenever you see the statistics, and that's why I say parents read what's going on in your school. Look at how they're presenting information on boys and girls.
Yeah. Well, just that example alone, the parents would be more worried about the girls than about the boys, whereas they should be worried about them both for different reasons. But if you miss the one part, you could very well have a tragedy.
Exactly. And so I hope that helps and I'm, enjoying this. Thank you.
Yeah, I would really love to have you back and talk also about this whole idea of toxic masculinity, which I like to reframe as more as a toxic definition of masculinity rather than masculinity is by its very nature toxic. And I think there are a lot of men who really want to take back that the values around masculinity, which I think are a lot around protection and providing, and there are a lot of positive ways that men are wired, and that's a conversation that needs to be had as
The
well.
overwhelming majority of men will never hurt a woman. or an
Right.
older,
Right. Right.
overwhelmingly, they're probably more likely to rush into a fire than they are to, I
I'm
mean,
glad I've not been tested in that area, but
good. It's good. Not yet. We'll make sure it doesn't happen. But there you go. But yeah, I agree with you. And we can have that talk another time. Be great, Paul. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Sean Kullman, thanks again for joining us. I know you want to make sure that we talk about the Wonder of Parenting podcast that Michael does, and I don't, for some reason I've not subscribed to that, and I will do that today because he's brilliant. You can find you at michaelgurian.com, and you're also the author with him of Boys, a Rescue Plan.
Yeah, and you can reach out to me at Sean K,
Yep.
SEANK at GIBM.us.
Okay, and we'll put that in the show notes. Okay, thank you very much, Sean. Have a
Thank you, Paul.
great afternoon. And people can find my coaching offerings at GreatDad.com/go. And I don't. It sounds like you wanted to say one more thing.
I'm good.
Okay. Until next time, stay strong.
See you, Paul.